Hi, I'm Adam Lazar, Senior Graphic Designer at CJ Senior Life. Thanks so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a wristlet key fob. I think this is a really fun and easy project to make, but it's also a really great technique for you to have in your skill set, because the same way that we're going to make this strap is the same way that you would make the strap on a shopping bag. And it's also the same way that you would make the pull on a zippered pouch. And you could even use it to make the drawstring on a drawstring backpack. So I think it's really important and you'll enjoy making this. All right, let's get started. Let's begin by taking a look at the supplies we'll need. Everything that I'm covering today is included in the printable instructions and supply list that you can find at www.cje.net/cyberclub. So I encourage you to print this out and follow along. I'm using a swivel snap hook that has a 1-inch opening. I also have a pile of quilting cotton fabric scraps. I suggest using a woven fabric like quilting cotton because it doesn't stretch. This project isn't suited for something stretchy like jersey knit. While I'm using a hook with a 1-inch opening today, you can use a hook of any size. You'll just need to adjust the width of your fabric accordingly using this simple formula. Multiply the width of the opening by 4 to get the width of your fabric. This hook is smaller, measuring a 1/2 inch, so my fabric would start out as 2 inches, because 1/2 times 4 is 2. You might recognize some of these fabrics from previous projects that I've recorded. This project is great for using up fabric scraps that you might have left over. The fabric that we need should measure 19 inches long and 4 inches wide, but it doesn't have to start out as one big piece. You can sew multiple pieces of fabric together to create a 19 by 4 inch piece, as I've done with this example. This is also a good opportunity to take a look at the scale of the print of the fabric and consider how that will affect the piece. For instance, in this fabric, it has an overall small pattern, and it doesn't matter how it's cut or folded. While the pattern in this fabric is bigger, but it will fit nicely down the center. I did have to keep that in mind though when I was cutting the initial piece. And then this fabric is a scrap that I used for making a pillow. And this is such a large pattern, it looks great on the pillow when we can see most of the fabric. But if we were to fold this down, we probably wouldn't really notice that this is a dandelion. So you'll want to keep that in mind when you're choosing your fabric. I also have coordinating thread and sharp needles in my sewing machine, as well as the usual tools and supplies, including an iron set to the appropriate temperature for the fabric that I'm using. Okay, enough chit-chat, let's get started. I've started by cutting one piece of fabric down to 19 inches long by 4 inches wide. I'm also going to make a second project using multiple pieces of fabric, and I'll show you how to do that as well. In order for this to work, each of these scraps of fabric needs to be 4 inches wide so that they're the same width as each other. However, the length can vary, just as long as I have at least 19 inches to work with. So measuring all of these, I've got plenty. I'll need to sew all of these pieces of fabric together on the 4-inch wide edge. So I'm going to put these two pieces together and hold them with clips, or you could use pins, and then we'll sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the 4-inch edge. I've got my sewing machine set up so that the edge of the presser foot is about a 1/4 inch away from the sewing machine needle. So I can just line up the edge of the fabric with the edge of the presser foot and use that as the gauge for my seam allowance. Because we're going to be making more seams along this piece of fabric, we don't actually need to do a back stitch for this part of the project. Okay, I've got two pieces of fabric sewn together, so I'm going to bring it over to the ironing board and press it so that the seam is open. That means that half of the seam is on one side and half is on the other. This reduces the bulk of the seam when we're sewing in the opposite direction. Now it's time to add the third piece, so I'll flip the two pieces up so they're facing up, and I'll turn this third piece so it's facing down. So we'll essentially have right sides together as we sew this one. And again, I'll sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, aligning the raw edge of the fabric with the edge of the presser foot. I like to trim the threads as I go so that they don't get tangled up in the machine as I'm sewing the next seam. I'll press this seam open as well. Now that I have all three of these scrap pieces of fabric sewn together, I can measure the overall length and cut it down to the 19-inch length that I need for this project. I'll measure out 19 inches, mark it with a fabric marking tool, and then I'll go over to the cutting board and cut this down to 19 inches. I've got both projects ready to go. They're 19 inches long and 4 inches wide. So I'm going to put these face down on the ironing board, and I'm going to fold them in half so that the wrong sides are together, so that I'm looking at the pretty side of the fabric. And I'm going to align the 19-inch long edges with each other. Then I'll take the iron and I'll press this really well to create a crease along the long edge. I'm also going to allow these pieces to cool completely. That really allows the crease that I've just pressed into it to secure. So with every step of the way, we're going to let these cool before we move on to the next step. Now that the fabric has cooled completely, I'm going to move on to the next step. I'll open the long strip of fabric and then refold it so that one long 19-inch edge is folded in towards the center crease that we created on the first step. And now I'll press this down with the iron again. Notice that I'm pressing the iron down, lifting up and moving it to the next spot and pressing it down, as opposed to running the iron back and forth while it's in contact with the fabric. Running it back and forth can skew the fabric and twist it a little bit out of shape. This kind of works for when you're ironing clothing because that's a completed piece. But when you've got pieces that are not quite sewn together yet, it can twist them out of shape and skew the measurements of your project. I'll do this for the multi-fabric piece as well, bringing the raw edge to the center crease, pressing it, and doing the same on the other side. And again, I'm going to let these two pieces cool completely before I move on to the next step. Okay, it's been a few minutes and I've let these two pieces cool completely, so the next step is to fold them in half again on the original center crease that we created at the beginning. We're just going to fold it in half and press it really well, and we'll do this for both pieces. And as I'm folding it in half, I'm making sure that the raw edges are tucked inside and are facing the center crease. And again, let them cool. Okay, again, I've allowed these to cool completely, and the next step is to thread the fabric through the opening of the swivel hook. What we want to do is align the two 4-inch sides of the fabric with each other, with the fabric pieces right sides together, and we're going to open this up so that the corners match as well as the raw edges. I'm going to hold these edges together with clips. Of course, you could use pins, and I'll do this on both projects because now we're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance along this 4-inch edge. We don't need to backstitch again on this part of the project. We just want to sew a seam all the way across. Be sure to flatten out the fabric as you go, make sure it's not twisted, keeping the raw edges aligned with each other. and remove the clips or pins if you're using them as you go. You don't want to sew over those. I'll trim the excess thread and do the same thing for the other piece. Now that both edges are sewn, we'll head back over to the ironing board and we'll once again press the seams open. Now remember, we ironed really well those creases that we were making, and we allowed the fabric to cool, and that's really going to help us right now because we've sort of opened it up, sewn it, pressed it in the other direction, and now what we need to do is fold it back to the original 4 folds that we had created. So those initial creases are going to help us put it back together. Make sure that you've got your raw edges tucked into the center crease, and this goes back the way we had it originally. And then give this a really good press. And I'll follow the same process for the multi-fabric piece as well. Now it's time to sew the 4 layers of fabric together. So to begin, I'm going to use clips and hold the open edge together all the way around this entire loop of fabric. And I'll do that for both pieces. What we're going to end up doing once we get to the sewing machine is sewing all the way around the right side of the piece, and then we'll do the exact same thing on the left side of the piece, making one continuous loop with our seam. I'm going to remove the bed of my sewing machine to expose the free arm for this step of the project. Now, most machines do this, so check your manual, see how you can remove it, and if your machine does not have that option, that's okay, you'll still be able to do this part of the project. You'll just have to have the project on top of the machine as opposed to looping it around the free arm as I'm doing right now. For a seam allowance, you can use a 1/4 inch seam, or what I'm going to do is move the needle of my sewing machine over to the right. Again, you'll need to check your machine's manual to see how that works on your machine. It may or may not do that. Most of them do. But take a look at what happens here. I'm going to show you again a little bit closer. The needle has been moved over to the right. This way I can get a really narrow seam allowance, but I still have the complete project under the presser foot. For this part of the project, I'll want to do a forward and back stitch to lock the seam. I'm going to sew all the way around the project, making one big loop. And I'll bring it all the way back to where I started. I'm going to remove the clips along the way and also adjust the swivel hook as I go to make sure that that's not in the way. And once I get back to the start of the seam, I'll do a forward and back stitch to lock it in. And once I've done one side, I'll do the other. And I'm going to start and stop at about the same place that I did for the first side, making a forward and back stitch and going all the way around, making a complete loop. I'll also follow the same process for the multi-fabric piece, making a complete loop on this one as well, both on the left side and the right side. Making sure that my fabric is flat and it's not twisted and it's lined up both with the edge of the presser foot and the 2 edges of the fabric are lined up with each other. Now that the left and right side are sewn on both pieces, it's time to lock the swivel hook into place. So on the instructions it says to sew about 1 inch away from the swivel hook, but you should move your project so that the swivel hook is not in the way of the sewing machine. That 1 inch is approximate, it doesn't have to be exact. What's more important is that you aren't getting the swivel hook caught under the machine. So what I'm doing here is I'm sewing all the way across from one side to the other, and then I'm using the back stitch button to go all the way back. And I'm going to do this a couple times, going forward and back so that I really secure that swivel hook in place. Now what I've done on this piece before I locked it in place is to adjust the fabric so I was happy with the design. I've got 3 different pieces of fabric here, and I just wanted to make sure that they were lined up in a way that I thought would be pleasing. And now that that one's done, we'll do the exact same thing on the project that has just the one piece of fabric. We'll put the project in the machine so that it's far enough away from the presser foot that the swivel hook isn't going to damage it, but also close enough so that it's locked into place. Going forward and back a few times using the reverse stitch button. Okay, well that completes the project. Boy, this is so easy to do and I've made so many of them. Guess what everybody's going to be getting from me for holiday gifts this year. Alright, so be sure to check out the instructions. It has all the measurements and the formula, and at the very end there's some directions on how to send us photos of your completed project. We'd really love to see what you've been doing. So there's a couple of ways. You can email us a picture of your project at community.engagement@cje.net, or you could also post it on social media, your favorite platform, using the hashtag CJECrafts, and also tag us at CJE Senior Life.
Thank you so much for joining us today. For more videos, please visit www.cje.net/cyberclub.